views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Straight ahead on this edition of Perspectives, Joe Biden is the president-elect of the United States. This coming after several days of waiting. The question came up after several times about the Electoral College, whether we should do away with it, whether it's still a good thing. Well, today we speak to someone who knows about the Electoral College, much about it, and at the same time also will be able to give us his take on the Biden presidency. That's straight ahead on this edition of Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime.
What's on your mind? Let 'em know. Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Let 'em know. Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, you speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective? Let 'em know.
And hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime, and we thank you for joining us. And as always, you can watch Perspectives every week here on Bronx. That's channel 67. If you have Verizon, of course, that's channel 2133, or anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. Want you to stay connected to us as we continue to talk. We'll be on the social media platforms, BronxNet TV, of course, and then my own professional page, DC Jaime 23, and my professional page, Daren C. Jaime on Facebook. Well, as we said at the top of the show, that President-elect Joe Biden is what he's now called. This coming after the race for Pennsylvania was actually called in favor of Joe Biden, pushing him above that 270 vote margin. Since then, a lot of questions have continued to be raised. Number one, by President Donald Trump and some Republicans, with the question as to whether or not votes were actually fraudulent. We know the answer to that one. But more importantly, on the part of the hearts and minds of Americans, a lot of questions about the Electoral College. And why we were forced to wait so long was because the votes and the Electoral College. Joining us now to talk a little bit about this is my friend and my brother. I'm glad to have him sharing for another edition of Perspectives. He is the former Bronx commissioner and president of the New York City Board of Elections. He's also an attorney and faculty member at CUNY BMCC. JC Polanco. And JC, good to have you back, brother.
I'm so happy to be here, and I hope your viewers have a good time today learning some of the fun stuff behind the Electoral College. Said no one ever.
Yeah, well, listen, I don't think anybody's talking about fun right now. I think as we talk, the president is calling for, of course, a halting of the votes. He's calling for a whole lot of stuff, calling for lawyers to actually intervene. And then on the other side, you got people talking about the Electoral College. We'll get to all of that. But first, give me your response, your take to this election and now President-elect Joe Biden.
Wow, we have never seen this kind of turnout. I keep hearing FDR versus Hoover as being anything close to this. What a divided country. My goodness. Mm-hmm. To think that one candidate is going to probably finish off with over 75 million, the other one close to 71 million. That's a lot of people and a lot of division in this country. Considering how polarizing President Trump has been since he walked down that escalator on June 16th of 2015, you would think that a president who has fought impeachment, who has fought all of the scandals in the last 4 years, wouldn't even come close. Conventional wisdom says there's no way that the popular vote would be as close as it is. And yet, at the end of the day, what we're seeing is what potentially could be a lopsided victory in the Electoral College for former Vice President Joe Biden and a defeat for President Trump. President Trump has all of the constitutional rights to have all of his grievances heard in the courts. Attorneys, whenever we go into court, we have to make sure that we sign something that we're telling the judge this case is not frivolous. He has attorneys representing him where they're claiming that there could have been potential fraud in some of these states. He's looking at states like Pennsylvania, states like Arizona, and in
Nevada.
Georgia and Nevada, saying that there were some irregularities. Now, the fact of the matter is this, and I know some of your viewers are going to be angry at me, like, when are they never angry at me? right? But the fact of the matter is that President Trump has declared several times that if he loses the election, it would be because of fraud. If you look at the primary election in 2015 going to 16, when Senator Cruz beat him in Iowa, he says because of fraud and irregularities. Throughout the entire campaign in 2016, he said, if I lose, it'll be for fraud. He wins. He still says that he lost the popular vote because of the millions of undocumented immigrants that voted against him. He launches an election fraud commission launched by one of the Secretary of States of Kansas at the time, and it was dismantled because we saw that there was no fraud. He's been saying that there will be fraud this whole time, and partly because there have been some talk of states sending absentee ballots to people who haven't requested. And if you inundate some states with absentee ballots, it could create an element of fraud, of what we call ballot harvesting and a fraud element. The fact of the matter is that Republicans in those states have said there is no fraud. The Secretary of State of Georgia says there is no fraud, so much so that both of the Republican senators from Georgia have demanded that the Republican Secretary of State resign because of his inability to catch fraud. Look, if you think there has been a perfect election in the history of the United States, you're lying to yourself. There's never been a perfect election. I've been at the forefront and seeing how this happens. Human error happens, right? There will be fraud that isn't caught. That just happens. So there will never be a perfect election, Daren. But the fact of the matter is that when you're dealing with a 5 million vote margin, when you're dealing with the kind of margins that we're seeing in Pennsylvania and in Georgia and Arizona and Nevada, it's very difficult to, with a straight face, say that someone has launched such a conspiracy of fraud against a president in his re-election campaign that it would require there to be court intervention for any retake or a revote. I see this as a terrible moment in our history where historically what happens is that decision election desks at major news networks and their statisticians look at the count and determine whether or not it is feasible for someone to lose that race. And when they determine that it's no longer mathematically feasible based on their formulas, there's a consensus by this nonpartisan board to declare who won. Right. And that's how it's always been. It was like that on election night in November of 2016. We didn't have to wait for the certification of the electors for that.
Right. Well, give me this because we talked about this on the show before. In the last election with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, we understood 54% of eligible American voters voted, right? Or did not vote, I should say, 54%. So when we look at these numbers and we see 70 plus million for Joe Biden, another 70 million going towards Donald Trump, the question has to be asked, how much of this was possibly new voter turnout? And then also how much of this was people who actually said, listen, last election I was on the sideline, this election I'm really engaged in the political process?
I think it's a combination. I think that when you look at the major cities across the country, New York City, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, and then some of the smaller ones, Milwaukee and Detroit, those popular vote numbers are going to come out hardcore against President Trump. You have to remember a lot of the votes that went for former Vice President Biden, as much as you may like him, were really anti-Trump votes by some of the larger states and more populous cities. So what's interesting, though, Daren, and I know this is a focus on just presidential talk, but it didn't really translate well to congressional members. It appears that Democrats would lose somewhere along the lines of 11 congressional seats. The Democrats did not pick up the Senate like they hoped. The best that they can hope for is winning 2 special elections in Georgia on January 5th and have Vice President-elect Harris, then probably Vice President Harris, be the deciding vote whenever there's a tie. So I have to tell you, it didn't bode well locally for Democrats, and especially in New York when we look at some of the end of the night numbers. Now, that's not to say some of these won't change with some of the mail-in ballots that come in, but it didn't bode well for some of those that have already been called.
Yeah. I'm going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about the Electoral College because a lot of people have questions about this Electoral College. Will it survive? Will we continue to see an Electoral College? And why do we have an Electoral College? Stay with us. Our guest, JC Polanco, will talk to us immediately after the break. You're watching Perspectives with Daren Jaime. back here on Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you, and we're so glad to have you share. We're talking about the election. We're talking about Joe Biden now becoming the president-elect, the 46th president of the United States, soon to be sworn in January, after one of the most contested elections in history. Not only do we have record votership in terms of people showing up and voting at the polls, a record amount of questions and controversies, some like never before. But JC Polanco is here with us as well, and he's also been sharing a little bit about this. And as JC, I want to get right into this because a lot of Americans forget about the fact we're talking about, recounts and all the other stuff. A lot of Americans just said, listen, this electoral college thing, it stinks. 270 votes. First of all, give us a history of where this electoral college came from, because from some people on the part of have said that this has been something that has had racial undertone and as well as political undertone.
Well, it's interesting. The Electoral College, I think it was Federalist 68 by Alexander Hamilton. It was proposed so that the population does not directly vote for the president of the United States. And when you think about some of the reasons why, well, our founders were, for the most part, not all, and I don't want to get into debates with history professors, were aristocrats. These were influential people. Many of them were wealthy. Some, as you well know, slave owners. And Alexander Hamilton was able to convince the masses at these meetings that having the people directly vote for such a powerful person who has the power to pardon and the power to use the military and the commander-in-chief may be dangerous, because we really can't trust the masses to make that decision. If we leave that decision to the population, they may vote for someone that's unqualified, just based on mob rule. They may vote for someone who has the wrong ideas. We need to take that power directly away from them and leave it in the hands of the learned. And in doing so, we will leave the popular vote to determine the electors that go and meet to determine the president. So there is a popular vote element to electing the president, and that's through determining who wins the popular vote in the states. That person will get the electors when they meet in January before the inauguration of the president. So in an effort to protect the position, the powerful position, we take away that right from the voters to directly make that decision, put it in the rights of what was considered to be at the time elites appointed by the state legislatures. And lastly, the Electoral College prevents mob rule in another sense, in that it forces a presidential candidate to visit all of the states. It forces a candidate to pay attention to the needs of the people in all of the states, regardless of if they're large or small. Without the Electoral College, conceivably, a candidate could just focus on the larger states and disregard Wyoming, Alaska, Vermont, Delaware, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota. You could go down the line of those states, and when we put all of them together, there's still more people in the Bronx than they are, right? So if we didn't have the Electoral College, the danger is that the issues and the needs and the interests of all of those people in smaller states would be ignored in favor of those in the larger states. So a person, just to give you an example of a popular person who may not be qualified to be president, but could gain enough support from major cities like New York, Miami, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, and Boston, the idea is that that person could ignore the rest of the country and potentially win the most powerful seat in the entire planet, right? So there's a reason for it. The racist element that you mentioned, Daren, I'm concerned about that, because there will be a racist element for any time we discuss the founding of this country. When we look at who got the right to vote, when we look at the 3/5 compromise as to determine the census of the country for purposes of representation in Congress, we could go down the line of the evils of slavery in our country. We could look at segregation and Jim Crow. We could look at the need for civil rights in the 1960s and how Reconstruction impacted the country after the Civil War. We could do all of that. But the fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, once we get to the bottom as to how can we define the Electoral College today, is to get the power away from the people, because the people were considered by many to be ignorant, not to have the smarts and the know-how to make this type of decision. And then how do we protect the interests of smaller states?
But on the other side, you got people, and I kind of feel a certain type of way when you win the popular vote. I mean, the bottom line is you got the popular vote, and you've got a popular vote. Imagine if something would have went the other way. You got a Joe Biden. It's happened before. In the last election, where Hillary Clinton had more of the popular vote, but yet and still doesn't end up with the presidency.
Right.
So when you have people who sit at home, they say, "Oh my God, my vote really doesn't count," because at the end of the day, we got more voting for Hillary than we do for Trump, and Trump still remains president. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
there's
true.
something to be said where, I mean, let me put the question out there. Could there be not ramification, modifications made with regards to the Electoral College, given the fact of what we're seeing?
Of course, there are many things that could change. There was a lot of talk about changing this during the Nixon administration. States could pass laws like some of the resolutions that we've seen proposed in some past, where all of the electors for their state would go to the winner of the national popular vote. The problem with that is that no state wants to give up its power, so they pass these resolutions as advisories. You could pass a constitutional amendment, and that's as difficult as me getting abs, Darren. So it's just not going to happen. The smaller states want to
It could
protect
happen,
their.
JC. It could happen.
No,
It just takes hard work.
it won't happen. I mean, and neither of those two there would happen. And interestingly, when you have your viewers are wondering why 270, real quick, there are 435 members of the House of Representatives, right? And there are 100 members of the U.S. Senate. Washington, D.C. may not have a senator or may not have two senators or a member of the House that votes, but they do have, under the 23rd Amendment, they have 3 Electoral College votes. So we take 435 because of the Congress. We add 100 for the Senate, that's 535, and 3 for D.C., it's 538. The majority is 270. So winning the majority of all of those votes combined give you the presidency of the United States. So in case you're wondering where the 270 comes from, and every state is allotted the number of Electoral College votes that's determined by the number of senators. Now, remember, viewers, every state has 2 senators, right? Every one, no matter how big or small. And to that, we add the members of the House of Representatives, right? So we take a state like, let's say California. Let's say I think it has 54 Electoral College votes. If I'm not mistaken, I would have to check the last census. Well, that would mean that 2 U.S. senators, right? So that would be 52 members of the House. So 52 members of the House plus the 2 U.S. senators equals 54. You do that for each state, but no state can have less than 3, right? So a state like Wyoming, who has half the people that we have in the entire Bronx, they have an automatic 3. They'll get 2 members of the Senate, right, which is 2 votes, plus at least 1 member of the House. And because House members are proportioned by population, every 1 member of the House representing roughly 700,000 people, well, then you can see why you're guaranteed at least 3 Electoral College votes. So the larger your state, the more Electoral College votes you have, because the more members of the House of Representatives you'll have. So still larger states have a lot more power than smaller states at the end of the day. A Democrat running for president walks in, with at least California and New York. And you're looking anywhere from 27 plus 54. Well, you do the math at home. Quite a large number of electoral votes. So it's a very interesting way of electing. I know the concerns that many of your viewers may have. But you have to understand the concerns of the founders and concerns of those that live in the smaller states, that their interests won't be paid any attention to. And that's a problem because they also have needs.
Yeah. Let me ask you this question. I think I got one more time before I throw the break. People talk about New York, and they say New York is a Democratic state. As a matter of fact, let me go to break because they tell me I need to go to break. I'll come back and talk to you, throw this question out at you
Sure.
right after we return here on Perspectives.
Great. Thank you.
Back continuing our conversation with JC Polanco, and I had a question before the break. And JC, when we talk about the state of New York, uh, we will say that this is a Democratic state. The state was called for New York. There's no doubt about it. But when we do the math and we begin to look around, out of the 62 counties that the New York State has, 47 of the 62 actually voted in favor of President Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Do we really have a Democratic state here in New York?
Great question. Look, I, like many others, would tell you that there are about 3 states in New York. They are definitely, they are. You have the state of Long Island, you have the state of New York City, and part of Westchester. Well, and then you have, actually, we could even break it up into more states, because when you look at Western New York, it resembles more Ohio than anything else. And upstate is his own planet. And then you know that Plattsburgh is very different from from Poughkeepsie. So how upstate could we get? There are many states. New York is one of this, the Empire State, because we're incredibly diverse. But the fact of the matter is that the population center is New York City. And because of that, we consider New York to be a blue state when it comes to presidential elections. The rest of the state consistently votes Republican. When you get out there, there's very rural. The voters think differently. They have different interests. The Republican Party talks to them a great more. They find the issues that the Democratic Party proposes, especially in New York City, to be reprehensible. We saw that Whip Clyburn, several Congress members of the Black Caucus in Congress were very concerned about some of the talk coming out of places like New York regarding defending the word socialism and socialist Democrat, and proposing things like defunding the police, which really was the incredibly irresponsible political slogan in history, because what it did was that it told the rest of the country that, there were Democrats that really wanted to defund the police and to dismantle it. When you spoke to them, you would discover that some really didn't mean defund, they meant reimagine. It was so irresponsible that it really cost Democrat seats in those places that you mentioned a little earlier, Daren, where they don't have precincts in their neighborhoods, and the only defense that they have may be a rifle and a 10-minute wait for a sheriff to show up. So those are the types of counties that we'll have a problem supporting some Democratic policies, even though they have major cities in their states that support Democratic caucus and causes, and that would normally sway an election one way or the other.
We're looking right now at a country that is admittedly divided. When you see the fact that, even though President-elect Joe Biden won by, several million votes, you're still looking at the President Trump still having a base of plus 70 million people who actually voted for him. And so the question that comes to mind is about unity. You hear President-elect Joe Biden talking about, I will unify this country. Can unity actually occur given the fact that we look so divided in a time such as this?
We are incredibly divided. President Trump has an incredible base. When he said during the campaign that he could shoot someone down Fifth Avenue and they'll still support him, I believe him now more than ever. This base is here to stay. They will follow him on Twitter. They'll follow what he says. He can start a TV network, and he can really lead a real serious movement in the country, similar to what he has led for the last 5 years. President-elect Biden will have a very tough time uniting the country. And the reason for that is when we talk about uniting the country, we mean culturally, we mean politically. That's going to be very difficult to do. Any Republican in Congress, specifically the Senate, who is seen to have been working with President Biden to enact some of his proposals, would be seen as a Republican in name only and will be primaried by the right. And because some of the most excited and engaged voters in any party primary are those that are the most conservative on the Republican side and the more liberal on the Democratic side, it'll be very difficult for some of these Republicans that do work with President Biden to win re-election. And what you will see is countless primaries happen across the country. We saw it during President Obama's 2 terms, when you had Republicans that were eager to work with President Obama to solve some issues. They were primaried immediately from the right and they would lose their primary. So senators don't want to get primary. They love their positions, and so do Congress members. And at the same time, if you had a Republican president like we had this time, and you had Democrats that would be willing to work with him or vote against impeachment or try to unite as so many want, you would have on the left primaries that would take them out quickly. You don't even have to support the president. If you saw with Joe Crowley right here in the Bronx, someone who was a moderate on some issues and tried to be a uniter by being part of that problem solvers caucus, that caucus that works on solving and finding a middle ground. He got primaried from the left and lost. You had the third most powerful member of Congress lose his congressional race to someone who's new to the scene that was very far left because he wasn't left enough. So it happens on the left.
Did he
happens on the
lose?
right.
Did Crowley lose because he was too left, or did Crowley lose because
No,
folks
'cause he
didn't come out in the primary?
Well, the combination of things, the excited voters, as I mentioned earlier, the engaged voters, your prime voters tend to be those that are more liberal on the Democratic side and more conservative on the Republican side. And until we really take a look, and this is something that I'll continue pushing here on Bronx and elected officials, until we take a look at the problems of the primary process in New York and across the country, we're going to have elections where you're going to have people from QAnon elected to Congress. You're going to have people that call themselves socialists elected to Congress. And that, at the end of the day, I think, in my opinion, and you may disagree with me, viewers, but in my opinion, it's just not good for our politics. It's not good for our democracy.
Yeah. Jesse, we're going to leave it there. Got to bring you back, but thank you for a lot of interesting information. Of course, it's always good to have you, my brother, as we talk. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree. We did pretty well today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being back on.
Hey, JC Polanco, my friend and brother there. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And always, we encourage you to stay connected to us here at Perspectives. Listen, this is what we do. We share our perspective, right? Some people say one thing and other people say another. And it's up to you to really find your way. And you can go on one side or the other. But I'm glad that we can bring perspectives to you and share your perspective. We encourage you to share your perspective because it just might make a difference in someone else's life. I'm Daren Jaime saying take care, God bless. And if you want another episode of Perspectives, tune in next week to Bronx S Channel 67. Rising Files Channel 2133. And anytime you want to see an old one, don't forget about BronxNet.org. Daren Jaime saying, God bless.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your